Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. The Italian referendum has added yet another victory for the resentment movement spreading like wildfire across Western democracies. What made the year of 2016 so rich in electoral surprises? And is the voters' revolt likely to continue into 2017? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Marco Vicenzino, a former consultant for the World Bank and the director of Global Strategy Project. Mr. Vicenzino, it's great to talk to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Now, just because we are on a Moscow-based channel, let me start with the Russia question. I know that you put all these major electoral surprises, the Brexit vote, Trump's victory, as well as the defeat of the Italian referendum, into one category of voters resenting the mainstream political establishment opinion. And there is a narrative in the West of suggesting that Russia is trying to exploit this resentment among the voters. Do you believe that Moscow had any hand in the way the Italian referendum has played out?
No, I mean, the Italian referendum was based upon a reaction by Italians against the current government in Italy. There may be sort of repercussions for Europe, of course, but I think it's important to look this within an Italian perspective. Is you had a prime minister who came into power, who was not a member of parliament, was never won a national election. He basically, legally and constitutionally, he did come to power. But what happened was that after a 2-year period, basically, people felt that there was someone ruling the country who actually had no mandate, trying to impose change upon the country in a way that the majority of Italians rejected. It does form part of the larger, we call reaction politics taking place in Europe and much of the Western world. But it's important also to look at this within an Italian framework. Reaction in Italy has been brewing for years and for a very long time. And when the current prime minister, who actually just resigned, Matteo Renzi, tried to impose it, people felt that he went too far.
Mr. Vicenzino, I'm sure you would agree with me that the same sort of processes have been brewing for a long time, not only in Italy, but also in the United Kingdom and in the United States, for that matter. But that didn't stop, major establishment politicians from blaming Russia for sometimes driving or at least cheering a certain electoral outcome. Do you think Russia in general would have benefited one way or another from the Italian referendum?
I mean, I think for the most part, it's the Italian government, specifically with Russia. If we look at it on a case-by-case basis, in the three major electoral upsets, if one would want to call them, you look at the Brexit, the U.S. election, and Italy. Brexit, yes, there was talk about it. I think the most serious one out of the recent ones was the U.S. election, whereby you have the intelligence community across the board saying that there was serious concern about some form of involvement. Candidate Trump said specifically, no, that's not true, and they're asking the President-elect Trump to come up with the proof to make his point. And what may happen is that when the new Congress, when there is inauguration on the 20th of January of 2017, one of the main points of contention with the Congress between President Trump then will become and the Congress will be about investigations, congressional investigations going into the issue of what's called Russian hacking into the U.S. election.
I just want to make a point that you just mentioned that, we are still waiting for that investigation to take place. But as you pointed out, the intelligence community already came out with the expression of, that belief that Russia was behind it. I don't want to argue about whether or not it was the case. We don't have any evidence in favor or against it. But I wonder if this narrative of Russia's hand was perhaps contributing to the fact that neither in the UK nor in the United States major political parties saw those surprises coming. Didn't it in a way blindside them to the real political processes that were taking place in their countries?
I think there's a disconnect that's developed amongst mainstream parties in Western Europe and the U.S. and ordinary voters. And what I mean by that is a reaction is there's a disconnect. In the U.S., I would call it, the Beltway bubble burst. What I mean by that is the 495, the ring road around Washington, D.C., is the 495 known as the Beltway, is that over the years, there was a large disconnect amongst the political establishment and the world beyond the 495, the rest of America. And it's been brewing for years. You saw it happening in the 2008 election, 2012, 2016. It happened that this time around, the bubble burst. And once again, this has been brewing for years, is that disconnect. It's also taking place in much of Europe. And Europe is far more complex because obviously you have many states within the European Union, each one with its own dynamics. What they share in common in Europe is a reaction to the system. Now, going back to your question about when you were saying about Russian involvement in these anti-system movements, within Europe, if you do a country-by-country basis, the accusations that are flying around right now in recent times has been closer relationships, for example, with Viktor Orban of Hungary, Marine Le Pen of France getting funding from Russia or support from Russia. In the Brexit case, I think it's different. The Brexit case, not so much.
But Mr. Vicenzino, I simply cannot understand what's wrong with those accusations. Those parties are part of the legitimate political spectrum. Mr. Orban of Hungary, he is not some sort of, I don't know, outlaw. He's the president of the country. So I think it's natural for, a country that expresses a somewhat friendly relationship towards country to explore those relationships. The same with Marine Le Pen. She's not running a banned party. Her party is gaining popularity. Isn't that only natural? Not only for Russia, but for many other political actors to explore whether, those parties stand any electoral chance, and if so, try to develop the relationship.
The party we refer to for specifically, say, for example, Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen is a product. The National Front in France is a party that takes several decades, obviously begun by her father, and it's been gaining popularity internally, not because of Russia. The accusations were that Russia is playing a role in financing these parties because many of these parties, they would take a position which would be more favorable to Russia. For example, if you look at the French elections right now, or the evolving French elections, put Marine apart aside. If you look at the new candidate of the center-right, François Fillon has taken a different position from the rest of the mainstream establishment in France of talking about an opening with Russia, an accommodation, call it a rapprochement. So even within mainstream political parties, there may be a slow change going on. And in France, it's a clear case. It's not just the far right, but it's a center-right candidate who's going to be representing the Republican Party in France. And if you go to Eastern, Central, and Eastern Europe, it goes beyond values. Many of these countries have interests. Obviously, there's the energy issue between, natural gas. Russia supplying many countries in Central, Eastern, and even Western Europe with natural gas. So many nations of the European Union, they may share common values, but they also have differing interests.
Well, many of those countries also have different economies. They have different migratory pressures. They have different unemployment levels. They also have different sort of levels of exposure to their debt country. So, on a case-by-case basis, they're very different. But one thing that they have in common is this allegiance to the liberal internationalist worldview that itself comes with a certain, and I would say very rigid set of views on economics, on foreign policy, and etc. I would like to get your personal opinion. How much of this downturn, how much of this voter discontent is due to the inefficiency of national elites versus their obligation up until recently to submit themselves to this liberal dogma that wasn't even allowed to be questioned?
That broad debate that you're speaking about, sort of a more internationalist, one may say even globalist view, as opposed to one based upon natural interest, I think that's more of a debate that's taking place at the higher levels. I think for common, ordinary European citizens, the fact is that they don't see, and particularly in the Mediterranean countries in Southern Europe, is they feel disenfranchised politically, economically, socially, and also culturally. Cultural identity has a lot to do with it. And when, as you mentioned, the migration issue was something that very much provoked the debate to a different level in Europe, just beyond economics. But I think it's a lot of ordinary citizens in Europe really don't feel that they're getting, and once again, it's not all European citizens, but the ones that are part of this you can call reaction political bloc, is the fact that life hasn't gotten better for many of them. They don't see an improvement. They see economic stagnation. For example, if we take the case of Italy, the introduction of the euro more than 15 years ago for many Italians did nothing. In fact, in Italy, you haven't had practically no economic growth in the last 15, 20 years. So for many ordinary Italian citizens, they say, where are we now and where were we 20 years ago? What has the euro done for us? Hence, you can get like a reaction party. You can get a reaction party in Italy, like the Five Star Movement, a core part of their platform, if they do come to power in a future election, is a referendum on Italy's membership of the euro, not Italy's membership of the European Union, but of the euro.
The issue that you're raising about Italy's participating in the eurozone, as well as Italy's debt issue, as well as Italy's migration problem, they all can be traced to a certain set of economic and foreign policy decisions that, again, were dictated by these liberal teachings. Let's put them that way. And I think the foundations of many of those policies were laid far before Matteo Renzi even finished his high school. I mean, he was in office less than 2 years. Why do you think the Italian voters decided to punish him for all those deteriorations that you just mentioned?
Basically, he was a person, as I said, he himself didn't have much of a political mandate. He had no political mandate, in fact. He felt that there was the old school of Italian politics, whereby the system, there's a political establishment and elite in Rome imposing a way upon the country, and the country rejected that. And you see that throughout much of Europe. Now, if you're talking about this, what may happen in the European Union is that integration for many people went too far, too fast. What they're looking for, I think what's likely to happen, we're having a series of elections in 2017, Netherlands, Germany, France, is by the end of 2017, you're going to have new political realities in Europe, new people governing. They're going to have to revisit the European narrative. Yes, the European Union was largely formed as a reaction to 2 world wars. But what happened is that for many people, the big question, and the philosophical question, much of it having to do what you spoke about, is the fact is that do we want a European Union that's federalist, a United States of Europe, or a Europe made up of the nation states of Europe where the national interest still plays a role? And what we've seen, the recent politics, it's shifting more to a national interest perspective.
Mr. Vicenzino, I heard you say that the referendum's defeat was also partially a result of political overreach on the part of Mr. Renzi. And one person who may have committed the same political mistake was, of course, David Cameron of the United Kingdom by calling on the Brexit vote. And what's interesting that in the hindsight, both of these votes seemed like reckless political gambles, but at the time when they were proposed, they seemed almost like sure bets. And I wonder, what is it about the year 2016 that made this discontent that we talked about earlier burst into the open? Because even a year ago, the developments that we are now discussing would have been unimaginable. What is it that triggered all these series of electoral surprises?
You know, basically, when I use those key words was disconnect and overreach. These are things that take years to develop. Doesn't happen overnight. All you need was one single thing to trigger off a chain reaction, which emboldens and encourages other people. In this respect, Brexit did play a big role in this in Europe, that it animated, it encouraged other parties throughout Europe and other individuals, it strengthened them, saying that you can say no to the system if the system is trying to impose something upon you. And that's a disconnect. In other words, that disconnect that evolved, and I mentioned, between the mainstream political parties and the grassroots, basically grievances over years that fester and accumulate. And if you can get one groundbreaking political event, that gets like a reservoir. The dam just breaks and then the flood takes place. To a certain extent, one could use that analogy, although it may be a bit too exaggerated, but in a sense is that's what happened, is that large extent people feel encouraged, emboldened, and then plus you get the United States, you get Trump's victory, whereby all the polls were saying that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Just days before the polls, they had 4 or 5 points ahead. And what happens is that those who want to say no, it gives them energy, it gives them life. It says that ordinary citizens can actually make a difference if you go to the polls.
Okay, Mr. Vicenzino, we have to take a very short break now, but when we come back, promising change is certainly not the same as delivering it. Is Trump running the risk of becoming the second Obama in this regard? That's coming up in a moment on Worlds Apart. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing the world at the crossroads with Marco Vicenzino, Director of Global Strategy Project. Mr. Vicenzino, I know you are often asked about Donald Trump, who is often compared to Italy's former Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, so much so that he's even earned the moniker in Italy, Berlusconi Americano. And what's interesting about Mr. Berlusconi is his seemingly endless political longevity. Now that Renzi is out, do you think Berlusconi can mount a comeback?
No, not a comeback, but he can still be a power broker. I mean, his party, Forza Italia, now according to polls is in the fourth place. Obviously, there's competition between the first two parties, being the Democratic Party of Matteo Renzi, the Five Star Movement, there's the Northern League of Salvini, and Berlusconi's party is now fourth. But if it can pull 10, 11, 12%, maybe a bit more or less, if there is a new election, they can become power brokers. He can be a kingmaker once again. Not he himself ruling the country, but influencing the shape of the country itself. That, yes.
Now, I think both Europe and the world, to some extent, are more or less used to Italian governments coming and living without anyone taking too much of a notice. But the American government is certainly different in that regard, in a sense that it certainly has a much bigger impact in what it does and what it doesn't do. Putting aside all the media gloss around Donald Trump, do you think he has what it takes to become the kind of game changer that he promised his electorate that he's going to be?
He's a dynamic figure. He's a person he's a doer in many ways. Well, the big question remains from an experience perspective, if he's able to delegate power to the proper people to be able to move forward. Obviously, he himself, in the private business world, he was the chief operator in the sense that one would even accuse him of being a micromanager, that even in his hotels, he would go down to make sure that the rooms were, according to design, the proper way he wanted. When you go to that level of the U.S. presidency, you really can't be a micromanager. You have to be able to delegate to proper people. It's a whole different rule, a whole different game altogether. So if he adapts to the political realities in the sense of delegating effectively, at the same time serving perhaps as a chairman, one would say, and those he delegates to are effective in and of itself, change can be made. Donald Trump, to a large extent, still remains a blank slate, particularly on the foreign policy front. If we looked on the domestic policy front, generally, his orientation. On the foreign policy front, outside of the trade issue, he's still largely a blank slate. His rhetoric says one thing, but reality may be something else once he assumes power.
Mr. Vicenzino, for all that differences in style and appearance and temperament, President Obama and President-elect Donald Trump did stress similar themes during their electoral campaigns, and the major theme was that theme of a change. Remember, Obama was insisting, yes, we can, and by that he meant changing the world, the way America engages the world, as well as conducts policies domestically. And I think a number of people would say that with disappointment, unfortunately, that 8 years into his presidency, his main achievement was getting elected. Not much else has been done. Anyway, I heard you say about Matteo Renzi that he was just a new face of the old system. How much of that was true about President Obama?
What Renzi I meant to say is the way he got into power. He went in through the back door, never being voted into government. In that sense, it was a new face smacking of old Italian politics. Going to Obama now, I think the problem with Obama, you used the word disappointment. The problem with Obama was I think he was a victim largely of his own rhetoric. During the 2008 campaign, he was preaching very high rhetoric, change and hope, and he created high expectations for many people. Much of that had to do with, disillusion after 8 years of George Bush for many people. So when he preached this high rhetoric, and then when there was no results, expectations weren't realized, then that creates a reaction. So one can accuse him of sort of over-promising and under-delivering. And one can use, for example, and it's not just in the U.S., but that was internationally. If you look at the Nobel Prize Committee giving him an award, when they gave him the award, it was an award based on intent, not result. So I think there was a lot of that hype. He became a victim of the own hype, which he contributed to.
Well, it's interesting you say that because obviously there is also a lot of hype surrounding Donald Trump, but perhaps of somewhat different sentiment. Many people are quite negative on him being elected, meaning that perhaps the expectations of his policies, his future policies, are relatively low. Does it doesn't that mean that he perhaps will exceed their expectations, that he has a better starting position compared to Obama?
I think right now Trump is largely a blank slate on many fronts. On the domestic front, less so, because on the domestic front, I think he's made quite clear the area that the orientation he wants to head to. But on the foreign policy front, apart from the trade issue, I think he is largely blank slate, and there are opportunities. He's very pragmatic. Even Obama said it himself after they both met. He's not ideological, and he's a fairly pragmatic person. So that in and of itself, I think, is an advantage that he has.
Can I just seize on something that you said just now? Because President Obama himself also positioned himself as this pragmatic and reality-rooted person. And at the end of the day, if we look at the number of his foreign policy decisions, be it Libya or Syria, they were highly ideological. I'm not even addressing the quality and the outcome of those policies, but the way the decisions were made were based on a certain degree of ideology. Are you sure that what we are seeing right now of Trump, that he is indeed that pragmatic as everybody talks of him?
Going back, we'll divide the two. We'll speak about Obama and then Trump. About Obama as an ideology, that's a mixed bag, I would say, in my opinion, because certain things he was ideological on, but other things he was fairly, not pragmatic, but I mean pragmatic not in a particularly constructive way. And what I mean by that is that many of the errors that he made were not errors of commission, were errors of omission, things that he should have done that he didn't do, and once again, preaching that high rhetoric, which was creating these expectations. If we go on to Trump now, Trump, I think to him, the worldview, according to Trump, is he wants to be he sees a world of big powers being led by big personalities, not so much of the rules-based traditional internationalist system. It's something more based upon the interests of the nation state. So although the rules-based system technically will remain intact, the way he will operate is probably more on a bilateral basis as opposed to a multilateral basis.
Again, Mr. Vicenzino, I'm sorry for interjecting here, but this is the argument we constantly hear in the West about this, the benefits, the beauty of the rule-based system. But let's be honest, the rules in that system are being broken on a regular basis. The way Libya was interfered with was not necessarily in accordance with the established international rules. I'm not even talking about Syria, where many of the Western powers are based without any mandate either from the government or from the United Nations. So, the rule-based system may be beautiful, but isn't that also a highly theoretical, if not utopian idea?
No. Technically, what statement I made before specifically, I said technically the rules-based system remains intact. What I mean by that is that a United Nations will exist, the World Bank will exist. Many of those post-Second World War institutions will continue to exist. But even during the Cold War era, during the 1990s and the time leading up to now, even within that rules-based system, many rules weren't complied with. If one were to believe that the rules-based system is going to have a 100% compliance, yes, that's utopian. The word you use would be correct. But the rules-based system provides a broad parameter, and in between those parameters, there's a lot of other things that go on that always don't comply with those rules. To think that there will be 100% compliance with that rules-based system is the word utopian that you use properly. I think when I mean the word pragmatic is understand that these institutions exist, these rules exist, but in between those rules, a lot other things will be going on. And I think the part of the world that Trump is going to be looking at is a world where the nation state has much more of a role than the rules-based system. Hence his emphasis on bilateral relationships, personal relationships. You may see a far more personalization of foreign policy under Trump. That has its advantages and its disadvantages.
That is exactly what I was going to ask you, and perhaps this is the last question we have time for. President-elect Donald Trump talked a lot about being ready to lead from day one, but I think it's clear for anyone who follows America's politics that transition will take some time. And given that there are also elections coming up in Europe, in Germany and France in particular, I think that may create a window of opportunity for a country like Russia to perhaps demonstrate the kind of leadership that it wants to see from the West. If I were to ask you what kind of mistakes you think President Putin has to avoid in this critical period, what would you say?
once you have a new American president, obviously the situation in Syria is going to his advantage. Aleppo will fall. Once Aleppo falls, I think Trump, together with them, together they're speaking about doing a specific, more engagement in the counterterrorism, which has been taking place for a few years, but to strengthen that relationship. In other words, where you see points of convergence in the relationship, emphasize that, move forward, and make that more into a reality. The things that divide you, say we're going to agree to disagree, but what brings us together in points of convergence, bring that to the next level, whereby there's engagement with clear results.
Well, that's a good advice. As long as the people on the American side are willing to take it, I think that would benefit all of us around the world. But Mr. Vicenzino, we have to leave it there. Really appreciate your time. And to our viewers, please share your comments on our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube pages. And I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.